For 7 long years, a solitary raven faithfully perched at the entrance of St. Jude's Hospital. No one understood its silent vigil until an unexpected event unraveled the mystery, touching everyone's hearts and bringing tears to their eyes. Raven, as he was known, was as intrinsic a fixture at St. Jude's Hospital as the wail of ambulances or the scent of antiseptic. His slender, dark silhouette was the first thing many saw arriving for the morning shift, and the last they saw leaving at night. Perched on the second-floor window ledge just above the main entrance, he watched the incessant flow of lives entering and exiting, never moving, save to preen his feathers or cast a piercing gaze upon the courtyard below. Nurse Ilara, with 30 years at the hospital and a heart that had seen it all, was one of the first to notice the bird's unusual presence. 7 years ago, when the raven first appeared, Ilara still remembered the initial curiosity, which quickly transformed into a persistent mystery. She tried to scare him away, concerned about hygiene and the hospital's reputation, but he always returned. In time, she gave up. The raven wasn't a nuisance. He was a presence. At first, Ilara's colleagues laughed at her fascination. "It's just a bird, Ilara," they'd say. But no bird acted like this. He didn't actively seek food, though there seemed to be a discrete source of sustenance no one could identify. He didn't interact with other ravens. He simply was. His stillness was almost supernatural, a dark, silent sentinel. For patients, especially those in prolonged convalescence, the raven became a kind of talisman. From their room windows, some would watch the bird, imagining their own stories for its vigil. A child hospitalized with a rare illness called him Guardian of Hope. An elderly man, spending his last days in the hospital, believed the raven was a soul awaiting a reunion. Each projected their own pains and longings onto the solitary figure. Ilara, however, felt something deeper. There was a melancholy in the raven's onyx eyes, an ancient wisdom that transcended mere animal instinct. She saw him on days of torrential rain, his feathers drenched, yet his gaze unwavering. On snowy nights, when the wind howled furiously, he remained there, a small dark smudge against the shimmering white. A ray of sun at times would catch his feathers, revealing a bluish and violet sheen, almost like an aura. The raven's presence was an enigma. He brought no flowers, no notes. He sang no cheerful melodies. He merely watched day after day, year after year. Ilara wondered what he saw, what he awaited. With each new patient entering through the doors, with each new life extinguished in the silent corridors, the raven was there, an impassive witness to human dramas. The question, why, echoed in Ilara's thoughts whenever her eyes met the birds. And that unanswered question made the raven's presence even more potent, a constant reminder that some mysteries are in no hurry to be unraveled. St. Jude's Hospital continued its relentless rhythm, a symphony of hurried footsteps, hushed conversations, and the urgent wail of ambulances. Within its walls, lives were born and extinguished, dramas unfolded in every room, but outside, perched on his ledge, Raven remained undisturbed. His presence, once a curiosity, had become as fundamental a part of the hospital's landscape as the garden trees or the entrance sign. For Ilara, who had already witnessed 7 years of his vigil, the raven was more than a bird. He was a fixed point in a world of uncertainties. She saw him as a silent witness, an unwitting confidant to all the joys and sorrows that St. Jude's doors beheld. But not everyone shared her perspective. Dr. Gabriel Mendez arrived at St. Jude's with a reputation as a brilliant surgeon and an administrator with an unwavering focus on efficiency. Newly appointed chief of surgery, he had ambitious plans to modernize the hospital and optimize every process. His eyes, accustomed to seeing the world in terms of charts and protocols, fixed on Raven on the morning of his first week. To Mendez, the raven was not a poetic mystery, but an anomaly, a potential source of sanitary concern, an unprofessional image for the facade of a cutting-edge hospital. "That bird," he asked Ilara during a morning round, pointing to the dark silhouette, "is he always there?" Ilara nodded, a subtle smile on her lips. "For 7 years, Dr. Mendez. He's called Raven." Mendez frowned. 7 years? That's unacceptable. Birds can transmit diseases and the image. We can't have a bird perched at the main entrance of a prestigious hospital. In the days that followed, Dr. Mendez acted with characteristic determination. First, he instructed the maintenance team to install visual and sound barriers. Small mirrors were placed on the ledge, and devices emitting predator sounds were activated. The sharp noise briefly echoed through the entrance, startling some patients, but Raven didn't even blink. He merely preened his feathers, his onyx eyes fixed on the courtyard below, completely ignoring human attempts to disturb him. When the visual barriers were installed, Raven simply moved to a slightly different spot on the same ledge, or to the eaves just above, a meter higher. He didn't fly away, showed no fear. He simply relocated with an almost defiant calm. An ambulance siren tore through the air, and Ilara heard the screech of tires at the entrance, but Raven didn't stir. Frustrated, Mendez tried a more direct approach. He instructed an employee to manually scare the bird away. The young man, armed with a long broom, climbed a ladder, hesitant. As he approached, Raven merely cast him a piercing gaze, a glint of ancient intelligence in his eyes. The employee felt a chill down his spine, and, with a gentle push of the broom, the raven took flight. But to Mendez's despair, he made a small circle in the air and returned to his original spot before the employee could even descend the ladder. Ilara watched it all with a mix of resignation and a hint of silent triumph. She knew Raven was no ordinary bird. He didn't bend to human logic, nor to its protocols. With each of Mendez's failed attempts, Ilara's conviction that there was something deeper to the raven's vigil strengthened. Dr. Mendez might be brilliant, but Raven operated under a set of rules that science had yet to comprehend. By the end of the week, Dr. Mendez was visibly irritated. He stopped at the main door, looking at the raven that stared back at him, impassive. The surgeon felt a strange mix of anger and a pang of reluctant fascination. It was as if the bird knew something he didn't, a hidden truth that challenged all his certainties. Raven remained there, a dark and mysterious smudge against the grey concrete, the promise of a secret yet to be revealed hanging in the air. The promise of a secret yet to be revealed hung in the air, but for Dr. Gabriel Mendez, patience was a finite resource. Raven's undisturbed presence on the facade of St. Jude's Hospital had become a personal affront, a silent challenge to his authority and his vision of order. The morning after his frustrated attempts, Mendez called a meeting with the hospital administration with a single item on the agenda: the definitive eradication of that bird. "We need a professional solution," he declared, slamming his hand on the table. "We cannot have a wild bird perched at the entrance, no matter how symbolic some may consider him." Mendez's gaze met Ilara's, who was present as a representative of the nursing staff, and he detected a glint of defiance in her eyes. Ilara, for her part, felt a pang of anxiety. She knew Mendez's determination and feared what he might propose. To her, Raven was not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be understood. The idea of aggressively removing him seemed like a desecration. Mendez presented his proposal: to hire a specialized bird control company, which would use more sophisticated methods, such as invisible nets or even a falconer. The suggestion of a falconer sent a shiver down Ilara's spine. The image of a predator being used to drive Raven away was disturbing. "Dr. Mendez," Ilara interjected, her voice calm but firm, Raven has never caused any problems. There are no reports of excessive mess or any health risks. He is, for many patients, a source of comfort. Comfort, Mendes chuckled humorlessly. Nurse Ilara, we are running a hospital, not a wildlife sanctuary. Public perception matters, and hygiene is paramount. Despite the opposition from Ilara and some other staff members, Mendes's determination prevailed. A few days later, a team of specialists arrived at St. Jude's. They installed almost imperceptible nylon nets around the ledge and eaves, hoping Raven would be discouraged from landing. The subtle sound of the wind in the nets was the only hint of their presence. Raven, however, seemed indifferent. He flew towards the ledge as usual, but upon noticing the barrier, he didn't try to force his way through. Instead, he landed gracefully on the stone gargoyle that adorned the hospital's facade, a meter above the nets, an even more prominent and unreachable spot. From there, he observed the activity below with the same serenity as always. The bird control team scratched their heads, perplexed. "He's intelligent," one of the technicians murmured admiringly. "He knows exactly what we want and how to circumvent us." Mendes watched the scene from his office window, his face contorted in frustration. The nets were expensive, the company's service even more so, and the bird, now perched at an even higher point, seemed to mock him. In the pediatric ward, little Sophia, an 8-year-old girl with big, curious eyes, watched Raven from her bed. She had been in the hospital for weeks, recovering from delicate surgery. To Sophia, the Raven was her friend, her guardian. She saw him as a sign that no matter how difficult the situation, someone would always be watching, caring. When she saw the nets and then Raven in his new spot, she smiled. "He's clever," she whispered to her mother. "No one can get him down from there." Ilara felt the same way. With each of Mendes's failed attempts, Raven's aura grew stronger, more mystical. He wasn't just a bird, he was a living legend within St. Jude's walls. His persistence was a reminder that not everything could be controlled, not everything could be explained by the cold logic of science. There was a silent force, an unbreakable will that defied all expectations. Mendes, on the other hand, felt increasingly cornered. The bird had become a talking point among the staff, and he could sense the veiled amusement and admiration many had for Raven. It was as if the Raven had become a symbol of resistance to his authority, a constant reminder that there were mysteries in the world that even the most brilliant surgeon could not dissect or comprehend. On a rainy afternoon, as water streamed down the windows, blurring the city view, Mendes was once again at the main door, looking up. Raven was there, his feathers wet, but his gaze fixed. Distant thunder made the ground vibrate, but the bird didn't move. Mendes felt a shiver that wasn't from the cold. It was this sensation of standing before something ancient and untamable, something that held a secret as profound as time itself. He wondered for the first time without anger, but with a growing and unsettling curiosity, what exactly Raven was waiting for. The question echoed in Dr. Gabriel Mendes's mind, a dissonant melody in his symphony of protocols and logic. What, after all, was Raven waiting for? The curiosity, once unsettling, had transformed into a silent obsession. He found himself looking at the gargoyle, where the Raven perched, even when he should have been reviewing charts or preparing for surgery. His eyes, accustomed to unraveling the mysteries of the human body, now tried to decipher the soul of a bird. Mendes began to research. Articles on ravens, their intelligence, their memory, their capacity for facial recognition. He delved into studies on animal behavior, grief in birds, even legends and folklore. But no scientific explanation, however elaborate, seemed to capture the essence of Raven's vigil. There were no charts for his persistence, no protocols for his loyalty. The bird challenged every one of his certainties. Ilara noticed the change. Mendez's glances at Raven were no longer of frustration, but of a contained, almost reverent fascination. One morning she found him standing at the main door, his coffee untouched in his hands, looking up. Raven was there, his dark feathers gleaming under the sun that finally broke through the clouds. "He has a way of making us question everything, doesn't he?" Ilara said softly. Without taking her eyes off the Raven, Mendez started, but didn't turn to face her. He's an anomaly," he replied, his voice lower than usual. "He defies all expectations." "Perhaps your expectations are wrong," Ilara suggested, a subtle smile on her lips. "Maybe he's not here to be explained, but to be felt." Ilara's words struck him in an unexpected way. Felt. The word echoed in his chest, a place where science rarely ventured. He had always relied on reason, on palpable evidence, but Raven was evidence that refused to be dissected. In the days that followed, tension in the hospital grew around a specific case. Little Sophia, the girl in the pediatric ward who saw Raven as her guardian, suffered an unexpected relapse. A sharp medical alarm tore through the silence of the pediatric corridor, making Ilara's heart pound. Doctors and nurses rushed, apprehension spreading like wildfire. Mendez, who was about to enter surgery, heard the urgent call and felt a chill. He knew Sophia was one of his patients, and her fragility was a constant reminder of the thin line between life and death. Outside, perched on the gargoyle, Raven tilted his head. His onyx eyes, which had previously observed the courtyard with an imperturbable calm, were now fixed on Sophia's room window. There was an intensity in his gaze, a concentration that did not go unnoticed by Ilara, who was rushing to the pediatric ward. Inside the room, chaos was contained. The medical team worked with precision. Mendez's voice, now in command, firm and focused. Sophia was fighting, her small body trembling. The girl's mother cried silently in the corner, her hands clasped in prayer. The constant beeping of the heart monitors was the only sound to break the tense silence. Mendez, at the height of his concentration, felt a strange impulse. He looked towards the window. Outside, Raven was motionless, a statue of dark feathers, yet with a presence that seemed to fill the air. For an instant, the surgeon felt as if the bird was observing every movement, every heartbeat of little Sophia. It wasn't a sense of judgment, but of a profound vigilance, a silent empathy that left him perplexed. The crisis slowly subsided. The monitors stabilized, Sophia's face pale, but now at peace. Mendez took a deep breath, cold sweat trickling down his forehead. He turned to the window again. Raven was still there, but what had once been tension in his gaze now seemed to have transformed into a subtle relief. The bird blinked slowly, almost as if sharing the exhaustion and hope that filled the room. Mendez felt a shiver run down his spine. That bird wasn't just a wild animal. He was connected. Somehow he knew. Mendez's scientific logic, so rigorous and unwavering, began to falter. There was something more at play, something that pulsed with an ancient and inexplicable truth, and he felt he was on the edge of a precipice, ready to fall into a mystery that challenged everything he thought he knew. The precipice opened beneath Mendez's feet, and he didn't fall, but floated in a vertigo of uncertainty. The ancient and inexplicable truth that pulsed in the air could not be ignored. Raven knew. That thought was a punch to the gut, a direct challenge to every scientific dogma he had upheld throughout his career. He spent the night awake, sleep eluding him, images of the Raven and Sophia intertwining in his mind. He tried to dissect the feeling, to analyze it. But it was like trying to hold smoke. The next morning, the hospital felt different. The lights had a stronger gleam, the corridors a deeper echo. Mendez walked, not to the operating room, but to the window closest to the gargoyle. Raven was there, a dark speck against the blue sky, watching. There was no longer anger or frustration in Mendez, only an overwhelming need to understand. He felt a new layer of skin, thin and translucent, separating him from the world he once knew, a world where everything had an explanation. Ilara found him there, his eyes fixed on the bird. "He's different today," she commented, her voice soft as the rustle of autumn leaves, more alert. Mendez, to her surprise, neither ignored nor corrected her. "Alert?" he repeated, the word heavy on his tongue. "Yes, as if he's waiting." "He always waits," Ilara replied, finally turning to him. There was a gentle curiosity in her gaze, an unasked question about the change she saw in the surgeon. Mendez hesitated, a rare occurrence for him. I felt something yesterday," he began, his voice almost a whisper. "When the crisis happened, it felt like he knew, as if he was connected." A faint, understanding smile blossomed on Ilara's lips. "I know," she said simply. "I've always felt it. A connection beyond our comprehension." Mendez's confession was a monumental step. That man of science, of relentless logic, was admitting the existence of the inexplicable. It was like watching a dam crack under the pressure of a previously untamed river. In the following days, Sophia's recovery was remarkable. She ate, played with her few toys, and most importantly, smiled. Whenever Ilara or Mendez visited her, she would point to the window. "My guardian," she'd whisper, her eyes shining. "He protected me." Mendez watched, and each time, the raven seemed to respond to the girl's gaze. A subtle tilt of the head, a low call that could barely be heard above the hospital's hum. It wasn't imagination. It was a silent dance, a dialogue that transcended language. Mendez began to spend more time in the pediatric ward, ostensibly to check on Sophia, but in truth, to observe Raven. He carried a small notebook, making notes about landing times, flight patterns, the bird's reactions to different hospital events. He recorded every sound, every head tilt, every blink. He sought a pattern, a key to the enigma. The obsession was now a personal case study, a desperate attempt to reconcile the irrational with the tangible. One afternoon, as rain gently tapped against Sophia's room window, the girl slept. Raven was on the gargoyle, his feathers drenched, motionless. Mendez stood beside the bed, watching the bird. "He's been here for 7 years, Ilara said, appearing beside him. Her voice was almost a shared thought. "You know, don't you?" Mendez slowly turned his head. 7 years. The number resonated in his mind. 7 years, he repeated, the implication settling in. The vigil wasn't recent. It wasn't a whim. It was a profound purpose, a silent promise stretched across time. "Yes," Ilara confirmed, looking at Raven. "Since the day the hospital opened this pediatric ward and the first child was admitted. He arrived that day and never left." A shiver ran down Mendez's spine, deeper than any cold wind. That bird wasn't just watching Sophia. He was watching all the children. The scope of his loyalty, the depth of his mystery, was overwhelming. Dr. Gabriel Mendez, the man of reason, was finally surrendering to magic. The weight of 7 years settled upon Mendez's shoulders like an invisible cloak, heavy with Raven's purpose and loyalty. The man of reason now found himself on the edge of an abyss, not of uncertainty, but of a truth that transcended all logic. 7 years, since the first breath of a child in that ward. It wasn't a coincidence, it wasn't random animal behavior, it was a mission. He spent the next night in his office, articles on raven behavior scattered across the table, pages turned face up, diagrams and charts now seeming laughably inadequate. No line of genetic code, no evolutionary theory could explain the devotion that radiated from that bird. The truth was, he was no longer looking for an explanation. He was seeking an understanding. The next morning, the hospital seemed to have awakened to a new reality. It wasn't a visible change, but a subtle alteration in the air current, in the whisper of the corridors. Raven's name, once uttered with skepticism or irritation, now carried a tone of silent reverence. Doctors and nurses, who had previously barely noticed the bird, now cast glances at the gargoyle as if seeking confirmation of his presence. Mendez, for his part, felt like a stranger in his own world. The surgical precision that defined his professional life seemed unnecessary in the face of the vastness of Raven's mystery. He visited Sophia several times a day, not just to check her progress, but to observe the interaction between the girl and the Raven. Sophia, recovering quickly, often sat near the window drawing in a notebook. Her drawings were always the same: a large, dark raven, with shining eyes, perched on a rooftop. "He's always there, Dr. Mendez," Sophia whispered one day, pointing to her drawing. "My guardian. He never leaves me." Mendez observed the drawing and then the real raven, who at that moment seemed to be watching Sophia with the same intensity. The bird tilted his head, and a soft, almost inaudible call seemed to echo only for the girl. It wasn't imagination. It was a silent dance, a dialogue that transcended language. Ilara found him in the pediatric ward, observing the scene. "Children's faith is pure, isn't it?" she said, her voice as soft as ever. "They see what we adults forget to see." Mendez nodded, without taking his eyes off Sophia and Raven. "I always believed faith was a crutch for a lack of knowledge," he confessed, his voice hoarse. Now I'm not sure what to believe." "Perhaps it's not about believing, Dr. Mendez," Ilara suggested, approaching the window. "Perhaps it's about feeling, and about allowing the inexplicable to exist." The idea that the inexplicable existed was revolutionary for Mendez. For years, he had built walls of logic and science around himself, protecting himself from the chaos of the unknown. But Raven, with his 7-year vigil, had demolished those walls stone by stone, feather by feather. He began to talk to other staff members, not about medicine, but about Raven. The chief pediatric nurse, Mrs. Costa, a woman with a serious demeanor and years of experience, revealed that indeed Raven had appeared on the day the ward opened. "I remember it well," she said, her eyes welling up. "The first child, a boy named Leo, was so sick, and there he was, on that rooftop, watching, always watching." Mrs. Costa continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Over the years, there were times we thought he had left, stormy days, heavy snow, but he always came back, and he always seemed to know when a child was in greatest danger. It's as if he were the guardian spirit of this ward." Mrs. Costa's revelation solidified Mendez's new perspective. It wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was a pattern, a story told by 7 years of uninterrupted vigil. Raven wasn't just a bird. He was a living legend, a symbol of hope for those who needed it most, especially the children. Mendez's curiosity was no longer academic, but deeply personal. He felt a connection with the bird, a resonance with its loyalty. The Raven, once an annoyance, had become a beacon, illuminating a path to an understanding that went beyond science, into the realm of pure emotion and unbreakable connection. The precipice was no longer frightening. It was a door to a world he was, for the first time, willing to explore. Dr. Gabriel Mendez plunged headfirst into exploring that new world. It wasn't a realm of microscopes and scalpels, but of whispers, coincidences, and faith. He abandoned the scientific articles on Raven ethology, which now seemed cold and empty, and exchanged them for dusty boxes in the hospital archives. There, amidst the smell of old paper and heavy silence, he sought not an explanation, but a story. He leafed through patient files from years, decades ago, from the pediatric ward. He cross-referenced data on hospitalizations, disease peaks, moments of crisis, and miraculous recoveries. At first, it was a chaos of information, but slowly a pattern began to emerge, subtle as a shadow, yet insistent as a heartbeat. The oldest records, those dating back to the ward's opening, had sparse, almost folkloric mentions of the bird on the roof. On stormy days when power failed and the wind howled furiously outside, or when a small patient entered a critical phase, the raven was mentioned more frequently. Not as a mere observer, but as a constant presence, an anchor point for the desperate hope of the staff. One night, while the city slept and the hospital hummed with its nocturnal routine, Mendez found a retired nurse's diary dated 20 years prior. Yellowed pages described a child's struggle with a rare illness. "The raven is there," she had written, her handwriting tight with tension. "He doesn't move. I feel he knows. I feel he's guarding. If he leaves, I fear the worst." The child, according to subsequent notes, had made an inexplicable recovery. The raven, for his part, had only flown away days later when the danger had passed. That diary wasn't science. It wasn't proof. It was testimony. And for Mendez, in that moment, it was more powerful than any clinical study. A shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't cold, but the sensation of touching a truth that transcended logic. Raven's vigil wasn't just 7 years. It was a legacy, a legend passed down in whispers, a promise that stretched far beyond what anyone could imagine. Exhausted, but with a clarity never before felt, Mendez walked to the waiting room window closest to the gargoyle. The night was dark, dotted with distant stars and the faint glow of city lights. Raven was there, an immobile silhouette against the sky, like a statue of obsidian. Mendez rested his forehead against the cold glass. His eyes, once trained to see only the tangible, now perceived something deeper. He no longer sought to understand Raven as an object of study, but as a being with a soul, a purpose. 7 years, Mendez whispered to the glass, to the bird, to himself. "No, much longer. You've been here for much longer, haven't you?" A soft caw tore through the night's silence, a sound that wasn't a warning, but recognition. Raven tilted his head, his dark eyes reflecting the city lights, fixed on Mendez. There was no fear, no distrust, only an ancient stillness. Mendez felt a lump in his throat. It was the sensation of being understood, of not being alone in his quest. It was the validation that there was something more in the world than he had allowed. He was no longer on the precipice. He had crossed to the other side, and the ground beneath his feet was firm, though made of mystery. The next morning, Dr. Ilara found him in the pediatric ward. He wasn't holding his notebook, nor did he have the tense expression of someone seeking answers. He merely watched Sophia draw a raven on the window, a tranquil smile on his lips. "He's different today," Ilara commented, her soft eyes fixed on the bird on the gargoyle. "More at ease." Mendez turned to her, a new gleam in his eye. "I think he's always been at ease, Ilara," he said, his voice calm and thoughtful. "It was I who wasn't." He looked again at Raven, who seemed to be looking at them. "I think I've begun to understand." Mendez's understanding was more than intellectual. It was an emotional acceptance, a surrender to the truth that pulsed in the hospital's heart. But at the same time, a new, even deeper question began to form in his mind. What exactly was Raven guarding? And why did he remain, year after year, in his silent vigil? The answer, he felt, was closer than ever and promised to be as overwhelming as the mystery itself. Mendez's understanding was a beacon, but it pointed to an even greater darkness, a deeper mystery. What exactly was Raven guarding? And why did his vigil extend over such a vast period, transcending generations of patients and staff? The following days were a silent dance for Dr. Mendez. He no longer sought Raven in the dusty pages of scientific articles, nor in the notes of retired nurses. Instead, the answer seemed to reside in the hospital's own pulse, in the air it breathed, in the whispers that echoed through the corridors. His routine changed. Visits to the pediatric ward became more frequent, not just to check on Sophia, but to observe life in its most fragile form, unfolding under the Raven's watchful eye. He began to notice a pattern. Raven was always there, of course, but there were moments of an almost palpable intensity in his vigil. It wasn't just when a child was gravely ill. There seemed to be a resonance with the most extreme vulnerability, with the threshold between life and the unknown. One afternoon, the hospital was swept by an urgency that made the corridors vibrate. A siren tore through the air, followed by the screech of an ambulance's tires. A small incubator, almost hidden under blue blankets, was hastily rushed to the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU. Inside, a newborn, still unnamed, fought for life, its tiny body ravaged by a rare and aggressive disease that defied even the most precise diagnoses. Mendez, who was in the pediatric ward, felt a shiver. It wasn't the usual chill of the corridors, but a current of air that seemed to carry the weight of that small, fragile new being. He walked to the nearest window, his eyes fixed on the gargoyle. Raven was there, but his posture was different. He wasn't just observing. He seemed to be in a state of profound alert, his feathers ruffled, his head tilted in a specific direction. The NICU window. A low, hoarse call escaped the Raven's beak, a sound Mendez had never heard before. It wasn't a common caw, but something that seemed to carry a mix of sorrow and determination. It was the sound of a renewed promise. Mendez watched the bird, then the NICU window, where the medical team raced against time. He saw Ilara, her eyes tired but focused, passing through the door. For an instant, their gazes met. There were no words, but a tacit understanding passed between them. Ilara also felt the change, the intensification of Raven's presence. That night, Mendez didn't go to his office. He sat in one of the waiting chairs in the pediatric ward, watching the Raven through the glass. The city slept outside, but inside the hospital, the battle for the newborn's life continued. With each nurse who passed, with each monitor beep, Mendez felt the urgency, and with it, the intensification of Raven's vigil. He began to leaf through the old diaries and records again, but this time, with the new lens. He wasn't looking for mentions of the Raven itself, but for patterns of hospitalizations. He sought the moments of greatest fragility, premature births, children who had fought from day one. And then, he found it. In a dusty record, dated 30 years prior, there was a marginal note made by a nurse. The bird appeared on the day little Arthur was born. He was so fragile, and the bird never left the roof until he was out of danger. Arthur. The name echoed in Mendez's mind, not just 7 years, but 30, and before, perhaps. Raven's vigil wasn't a response to a specific illness, nor to a particular child. It was a response to the inherent fragility of life itself, especially in its most vulnerable beginning. It was a promise of protection for those who had barely begun to breathe. The question, what does he guard, began to transform into, what does he protect? And the answer forming in Mendez's mind was as simple as it was profound. Raven protected the flame of life, the first and most precious breaths, the hope of a future that had barely begun. His vigil was a shield against the darkness, an ancestral promise. A soft caw echoed from the gargoyle, and Mendez looked up. Raven was no longer looking at the NICU, but directly at him, as if confirming his new understanding. There was a solemnity in that gaze, a wisdom that transcended time. Mendez felt tears well up, not from sadness, but from a profound and overwhelming truth. He wasn't just on the precipice. He stood upon the very foundation of the hospital's soul, and Raven was its silent guardian. The why was still shrouded in mist, But the what was crystal clear, and it was more moving than any science could explain. The truth, for Mendez, was no longer an equation to be solved, but a melody that resonated through the hospital corridors, a song of promise and vulnerability. He observed Raven, not with the curiosity of a scientist, but with the reverence of one witnessing a daily miracle. The Raven's vigil on the gargoyle had become a beacon for him, a fixed point in a sea of uncertainties. That tiny newborn in the NICU, still unnamed, was the epicenter of Mendez's new understanding. Its silent struggle was an echo of the countless battles fought within those walls. And Raven was the guardian of them all. The days dragged on, marked by the rhythmic beeps of the NICU monitors and Raven's immutable presence on the gargoyle. Mendez spent hours in the pediatric ward, no longer reviewing charts, but observing the children, their parents, and the palpable hope that filled the space. He noticed that Ilara also seemed more attentive to the Raven. Their gazes met frequently, laden with a new complicity, a shared acceptance of the inexplicable. One morning, Ilara approached him, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. "The baby isn't improving," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Tests show nothing we can treat. It's as if life is just ebbing away." Mendez felt a tightening in his chest. He looked at the window, at Raven's dark, motionless silhouette. The Raven hadn't moved from the gargoyle since the baby's arrival. His posture was one of unwavering vigilance, his feathers slightly ruffled, as if ready to confront an invisible threat. "He knows," Mendez replied, his voice hoarse. "He always has." Ilara looked at him, her blue eyes reflecting a mix of exhaustion and cautious curiosity. "You really believe that, don't you?" Mendez nodded. "It's not a matter of belief, Ilara. It's a matter of witness. How many times has the inexplicable happened here? How many children have recovered against all odds while Raven was there?" He paused, his eyes fixed on the bird. He's not just an observer, he's a part of the healing. That afternoon, a storm erupted over the city. Lightning sliced through the sky, and the wind howled, making the hospital windows rattle. The power flickered, and for an instant the NICU lights went out, plunging the corridor into momentary darkness before the automatic generators kicked in. In that brief lapse, a sharp shriek from an ICU monitor tore through the air, followed by a frantic rush of nurses. Mendez, who was nearby, felt his heart pound. He rushed to the window. Raven was there, defying the fury of the elements. But this time he wasn't just motionless. He was cawing, a loud, piercing sound that seemed to cut through the storm's roar. It wasn't an alert caw, but one of deep anguish, almost a lament. His dark eyes were fixed on the NICU window, where the shadows of the medical team moved in desperation. The scene was overwhelming. The tiny baby fought, the team fought, and outside the Raven fought with them, his voice a hoarse chorus of pain and determination. Mendez felt a wave of emotion. It was the materialization of everything he had discovered. Raven was not indifferent. He felt, he guarded, he protected. Later, when the storm subsided and the hospital resumed its routine, Mendez returned to the window. Raven was calmer but still vigilant. The NICU team had managed to stabilize the baby, but the prognosis was still grim. Mendez sat down, exhausted, but with renewed clarity. The what was clear. Raven protected the most fragile life. But the why? Why this Raven? Why this hospital? Why this dedication that defied nature itself? He remembered an old note from one of the retired nurse's diaries, which he had quickly read and dismissed as rambling. "He reminds me so much of..." The tight handwriting ended abruptly there. The ink faded by time. Mendez had presumed she referred to another patient. But what if she didn't? What if there was a more personal, deeper connection he had yet to unravel? He wasn't just the guardian of life. Perhaps he was an echo of a life, a persistent memory that refused to fade. The question shifted again in his mind, becoming more intimate, more painful. Was Raven guarding a life, or was he guarding the memory of a life? And that memory, he felt, was about to reveal itself with a force that would shake the foundations of the hospital and his own heart. Mendez couldn't sleep. The nurse's unfinished phrase, "He reminds me so much of," spun in his mind, a ghostly echo that refused to be ignored. The truth was no longer a matter of pure science, but of a broken heart, of a loyalty that defied mortality itself. He returned to the archives the next morning, his footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn silence of the hospital. This time, he wasn't looking for patterns. He was looking for a story, for a life. He found the record of Sofia Ribeiro, the nurse who had made the marginal note. Her file was impeccable, years of dedicated service, praised for her compassion and attention to detail. But there was a gap, an abrupt pause in her employment history, shortly after the period when little Arthur had fought for his life. The same period when Raven was first noticed. Sofia had retired early, without a clear reason in the formal records. With each page turned, Mendez felt the urgency grow. The constant beeping of the NICU monitors, though muffled by distance, was a cruel reminder of the silent battle the newborn was still fighting. Outside on the gargoyle, Raven maintained his vigil, an immobile silhouette against the pale sky that was beginning to lighten. Mendez continued his search, delving into leave records, personal notes, and even the local newspaper's obituary from that era, which was filed with the hospital documents. And then he found it. Not in a medical record, but in a condolence note attached to Sofia Ribeiro's file. Dated a few weeks before the note about Raven and Arthur, a small death notice: Gabriel Ribeiro, son of Sofia Ribeiro, born premature in that same hospital and passed away just 3 days later. An electric shock ran through Mendez. Gabriel. The name resonated with the pain that wasn't his, but which he felt deeply. The note, "He reminds me so much of," didn't refer to Arthur. It referred to Gabriel, or perhaps more profoundly, to the love and pain of a mother who had lost her child, and who saw in the Raven's unwavering persistence a resonance with the very intensity of her grief, or with the devotion of someone who loved Gabriel. Mendez closed his eyes, the image of little Gabriel, a life that had barely begun and had already ended, etched in his mind. Raven's vigil wasn't just about protecting fragile life. It was about honoring the life that was lost, about being a guardian of memory, a beacon of hope for those facing the same pain. Raven was an echo of Sofia's sorrow, a reminder that life, even the briefest, mattered. He looked up at the window. Raven was there, his dark feathers absorbing the first rays of sun. The Raven wasn't looking at the NICU, but at the exact spot where Mendez was sitting, as if he knew, as if he had waited for him to finally understand. A low, soft caw escaped the bird's beak, a sound that to Mendez was no longer a mystery, but a song of lament and promise. At that instant, Ilara appeared in the corridor, her shoulders slumped, her face pale. "The baby took a significant turn for the worse overnight," she whispered, her voice choked. "We're doing what we can, but—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. The pain in her eyes was eloquent. She looked at the gargoyle, at Raven, and a heavy sigh escaped her lips. "He's there, isn't he?" Mendez nodded, his own eyes welling up. "He always will be," he replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. "And now I know why." The truth, as painful as it was liberating, had revealed itself. Raven was not just a mystery to be solved, but a living monument to memory, loyalty, and pain. The question, "What does he protect?" had finally found its deepest answer. He protected hope, life, and the memory of those who hadn't had the chance to live. Mendez picked up the phone, his hands trembling slightly. He had to find Sofia Ribeiro. The story wasn't complete without her. He needed her to know that her Gabriel hadn't been forgotten, that her pain had a silent guardian, a raven who, for decades, had carried the weight of a promise that transcended time and species. The melody of truth, now clear, called for a voice, a mother's voice. Mendes dialed the number, his fingers trembling slightly over the phone screen. Each digit was a step towards a truth he both feared and yearned for. The device emitted a sharp tone before it began to ring. Ilara watched, her eyes fixed on him, then on the window, where Raven's silhouette was a dark speck against the sky that was now fully brightening. The call rang once, twice, 3 times. Mendes's heart pounded against his ribs. He imagined Sofia Ribeiro, an elderly woman, perhaps confused, perhaps embittered by memory. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was faint, yet firm, laden with the weight of years. "Mrs. Ribeiro? This is Dr. Mendes from St. Jude's Hospital. I'm so sorry to bother you, but I need to speak about something very important. About your son, Gabriel." There was a silence on the other end of the line. So profound, Mendes thought the connection had dropped. He heard a sigh, a sound that seemed to tear at the soul. "Gabriel," Sofia's voice whispered, the name an echo of pain. "What do you want with my Gabriel? He's been gone for so many years." "I know, Mrs. Ribeiro. I found your notes in the archives, and there's something else. A raven. The raven that's been on the hospital gargoyle for 7 years. I believe he's connected to Gabriel and to you." Another silence, longer this time. Mendes could feel the resistance, the repressed pain he had awakened. Outside, Raven let out a low caw, almost inaudible, but which Mendes felt in his bones. "You're mad, doctor," Sofia finally said, her voice choked, but with a touch of anger. "There's no connection. It's just a bird." "He's not just a bird, Mrs. Ribeiro," Mendes insisted, his voice gaining strength. "He's been there day after day, rain or shine. He was there when Arthur fought for his life. He's there now, while another baby is dying in the NICU, an unnamed baby as fragile as Gabriel was, and your notes. He reminds me so much of... You wrote that about the raven, didn't you? Not about Arthur." The sound of Sofia's crying came through the phone, a muffled sob that cut Mendes like a knife. Ilara stepped forward, her hand reaching for Mendes's arm in a gesture of silent support. I can't talk about it," Sofia sobbed. "I can't." "Please, Mrs. Ribeiro," Mendes pleaded, the desperation in his voice palpable. "This baby needs us. He's fighting just as Gabriel fought, and I feel that the raven, that your story, might be the key to understanding what's happening, to saving him." He paused, taking a deep breath, his eyes fixed on Raven. "When Gabriel was here, when he passed, was the raven there? Did you see him?" There was a long moment of silence. Only the distant sound of Sofia's crying. Then her voice, now a thin thread, began to unravel. "Yes," she whispered. "He was there. Not on the gargoyle, not at first. He stayed on Gabriel's room window. He appeared the day Gabriel was born, and he didn't leave, not even after he left us." The revelation hit Mendes with the force of silent thunder. It wasn't a memory. It was a presence, a promise. "He stayed there," Sofia continued, her voice gaining a strange strength as if memories were tearing through her chest. "I thought I was going mad. A raven, every day. The other nurses didn't see him or didn't want to see him, but I did. He seemed so vigilant, so protective, as if he was waiting for something or guarding something." "He was guarding Gabriel's memory," Mendes said, his own voice choked. "He was guarding your pain and the hope that no other mother would feel what you felt." I remember once," Sofia said, her voice now almost a lament. "I was there, Alone with Gabriel after he passed. The raven was at the window, and he cawed, not a loud caw, but a soft sound, and he dropped a small black feather onto the windowsill. I kept that feather for years. Mendez felt tears stream down his face. Ilara, beside him, was also crying silently. The mystery was no longer a puzzle, but a tragedy, an ode to loyalty and pain. "Mrs. Ribeiro," Mendez said, his voice hoarse, "I know it's difficult, but the baby in the NICU, he needs you. He needs you to come, to tell your story. I feel that the raven, that your story, is trying to tell us something through him, through you." There was a long sigh from the other side. "Coming to the hospital." "I can't, doctor. I can't go back there." "Please," Mendez insisted, the urgency growing in his chest. "Not for you, not for me, for Gabriel, and for this little one who is fighting. The raven is waiting for you. He is there for you." The silence that followed was filled only by the distant beep of the NICU monitors and the sound of the wind outside, while Raven remained motionless on the gargoyle, his dark form a promise of a truth that was finally about to fully unfold. Mendez knew Sophia's decision was crucial. The melody of truth had found its voice, and now that voice needed to sing. The silence on the other end of the line seemed to swallow the world. Mendez held his breath, the phone heavy in his hand. Ilara, her eyes fixed on him, waited, the tension palpable between them. Outside, Raven remained motionless, a statue of feathers against the sky that was turning a deeper blue. I don't know if I can." Sofia Ribeiro's voice finally broke the silence, a fragile whisper that carried the weight of decades of pain. "Going back there, it's like opening a wound that never healed." "I understand, Mrs. Ribeiro," Mendez replied, his voice soft, yet firm. "But it's not just for you, nor for me. It's for Gabriel. It's so his story isn't just a note in a file, but a lesson in hope. And it's for this baby who needs a chance. He needs someone to fight for him, just as you fought for Gabriel." There was a long sigh from the other side, a sound that seemed to tear at Sophia's soul. Mendez could almost see her, an elderly woman, reliving the darkest day of her life. The constant beeping of the NICU monitors, now more audible, was a cruel reminder of the race against time. "The feather," Sophia said, her voice almost inaudible. "I still have it. The black feather he left on the window. I kept it in a small box, along with the only photo I have of my Gabriel." A tear ran down Mendez's face. The feather, a symbol of a silent promise kept for so many years. "Please, Mrs. Ribeiro," he pleaded, his voice choked. "Bring the feather, bring the photo, bring your story. He is waiting for the truth to finally be told, for the melody of the promise to echo through these corridors again." The silence returned, but this time it felt different. It wasn't a silence of refusal, but of deep deliberation. Mendez could feel the decisive moment, the life of the baby in the NICU, the redemption of an ancient pain. Everything hung by a thread. I will," Sophia finally said, her voice still weak, but with newfound determination. "I will, but I don't know if I'll have the strength to go inside, to see that place again." "We'll be here, Mrs. Ribeiro," Ilara interjected, her voice full of compassion. "We'll be with you every step of the way. You won't be alone." Mendez nodded, a lump in his throat. "Thank you, Mrs. Ribeiro." "Thank you very much." He hung up the phone, feeling the weight of responsibility and hope. The truth was on its way, but with it would come the pain of a memory that had been sealed for decades. "She's coming," Mendez whispered to Ilara, his eyes welling up. Ilara squeezed his hand. "And the baby?" Mendez shook his head. "No improvement. Dr. Almeida is doing his best, but he didn't need to finish." The urgency was palpable in the air. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Mendez and Ilara waited in the lobby, their eyes fixed on the entrance door, every fiber of their beings tense. The morning sun now flooded the hospital, but the atmosphere remained charged. Raven, outside on the gargoyle, seemed to watch the street with even greater intensity, his head tilted, as if listening for the engine of every approaching car. A taxi pulled up in front of the hospital. An elderly woman, small and stooped, emerged from the vehicle, her steps slow and hesitant. She wore a dark coat, and her white hair was pulled back in a bun. In her aged hands, she clutched a small leather purse, old and worn. Her eyes, though tired, carried a depth of pain and wisdom that Mendez recognized immediately. It was Sofia Ribeiro. She stopped on the sidewalk, her eyes sweeping the hospital's facade, a mix of dread and strange resignation on her face. Then, her eyes lifted, searching for the gargoyle. Raven was there watching her. A low, melancholic caw escaped his beak, a sound Sofia seemed to recognize. And a silent tear traced a path down her wrinkled face. Mendez and Ilara approached her, their hearts pounding. Past and present were about to collide, and the melody of truth, silenced for so long, was about to resonate throughout the hospital. Hope, fragile as the life of the baby in the NICU, hung in the air, awaiting the final unfolding of a promise that had transcended time and death itself. Mendez and Ilara walked towards Sofia, their faces marked by anticipation and compassion. The elderly woman seemed to shrink under the weight of that place, the hospital that had been the stage for her greatest joy and her deepest desolation. Her tear-filled eyes fixed on Mendez, then on Ilara, as if seeking in them the strength she lacked. "Mrs. Ribeiro," Mendez began, his voice soft, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." Sofia merely nodded, unable to speak. Her aged hand trembled as it touched Mendez's, a cold and fragile touch. Ilara offered a gentle smile, a gesture of silent support that seemed to penetrate some of the armor of pain Sofia carried. "We don't have to go in right now if you can't," Ilara said, her voice calm and comforting. "We can stay out here for a bit." Sofia slowly shook her head, her eyes still fixed on the gargoyle where Raven was. The Raven, in turn, tilted his head, watching her with an intensity that seemed to transcend animal comprehension. A second caw, softer than the previous one, floated in the air, and Sofia closed her eyes, a solitary tear tracing a path down her cheek. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I need to. For him. For Gabriel." With Mendez and Ilara's help, Sofia took the first step towards the hospital entrance. Each step was a battle, each inhalation a suffocating memory. The smell of disinfectant, the distant sound of gurney wheels, the muffled murmur of voices, everything seemed to assault her senses, bringing forth ghosts of a past she had tried to bury for decades. As she crossed the threshold, a shiver ran through her body. She stopped, her hands clutching the small leather purse against her chest, as if guarding a fragile treasure. Her eyes swept the lobby, the reception, the corridors that stretched to the right and left, each one a door to a painful memory. "It's difficult, I know," Mendez said, his voice laden with empathy. "But we are with you." Ilara held Sofia's other arm, offering firm support. Together they began to guide her slowly down the main corridor. Sofia's silence was a lament, a mute cry that echoed through the hospital walls. Other staff and visitors passed by, oblivious to the profound tragedy unfolding before them, to the woman who carried the weight of a forgotten promise. As they advanced, Sofia looked up at a high window overlooking the inner courtyard. There, perched on a stone ledge, was Raven, watching them. His dark eyes seemed to penetrate Sofia's soul, a connection only the two of them could understand. A silent recognition passed between them, a renewed promise. He always knew," Sofia murmured, her voice almost inaudible, but with a strange conviction. "He was always there." Mendez felt a shiver. Raven's constant presence was no longer just a mystery, but a witness, a guardian of a truth that was about to be revealed. They approached the NICU area. The sound of monitors, once distant, now grew sharper, a pulsating reminder of the urgency. Sophia trembled, her steps slowing even further. That was the place where Gabriel's life had ebbed away, where her mother's heart had been shattered. "No, I can't," she whispered, her knees threatening to give way. "I can't see another baby." Her eyes filled with dread. The image of little Gabriel, fragile and helpless, fighting for every breath, haunted her. Doctor Almeida emerged from the NICU at that moment, his face tired and grave. He looked at Mendez, then at Sophia, his eyes conveying a grim message. "Doctor," Mendez said, his voice tense. "How is he?" Almeida shook his head, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. "No significant changes. He's fighting, but we're losing the battle, Mendez. He needs a miracle." The words struck Sophia like a physical blow. She clutched the leather purse even tighter, her eyes fixed on the NICU door, where a tiny baby, unnamed, without a mother present to fight for him, was waging the same battle her Gabriel had fought. The pain was overwhelming, but amidst it, a spark of determination began to glow in her tired eyes. The raven, outside, let out a loud, clear caw, a sound that seemed to cut through the heavy hospital air, a call that could not be ignored. Sophia lifted her head, her eyes fixed on the NICU door. The feather and the photo were in her purse, Gabriel's story in her heart. The melody of truth, silenced for so long, was about to echo through those corridors, not just as a lament, but as a hymn of hope. The raven's caw tore through the air, a primal call that echoed not only through the hospital corridors, but also in Sophia Ribeiro's soul. It was a sound she recognized from a distant past, a lament and a promise. Her eyes, once filled with dread, now carried a fierce determination, the same that compels a mother to protect her child. The baby in the NICU, fragile and unnamed, was a painful reflection of Gabriel, but also a new chance, an echo crying out for hope. "I can do it," Sophia whispered, her voice still choked but firm. "I'm going in." With a nod to Mendez and Ilara, she clutched the small leather purse against her chest and, with hesitant but resolute steps, crossed the threshold of the neonatal intensive care unit. Dr. Almeida, surprised by the sudden change in her demeanor, made way. The air inside the NICU was heavy with the scent of antiseptics and the incessant symphony of monitors. Each beep, each mechanical whisper of the respirators was a stab to Sophia's heart. Her eyes swept across the small incubators, each harboring a tiny life struggling to bloom. Finally, she stopped beside the crib of the baby Mendez was so concerned about. The newborn was so small, so vulnerable, its chest rising and falling with visible effort. A tangle of tubes and wires kept it connected to life, a sight that brought back the memory of Gabriel with overwhelming force. Sophia felt tears roll down, but she didn't hold them back. They were tears of pain, yes, but also of newfound courage. "Mrs. Ribeiro," Mendez began, his voice soft, "if you need a moment." Sophia shook her head. She opened the leather purse with trembling hands, revealing its contents. First, an old, faded photograph. It was a boy with bright eyes, perhaps 7 years old, smiling shyly. Beside him, perched on his shoulder, was a raven with dark feathers and intelligent eyes. "That's Gabriel," she said, her voice choked. "My son. And that's Raven." Mendez, Ilara, and Dr. Almeida drew closer, their gazes fixed on the image and on the black feather Sophia took from the purse, a simple object, yet laden with meaning. Gabriel loved animals. He found Raven as a wounded chick. He saved him, Sophia continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. They were inseparable. Raven would visit him every day, even here at the hospital. He would come in through the window, perch on the sill, and watch Gabriel. Dr. Almeida frowned, a pang of recognition in his eyes. I remember a raven, many years ago, but I thought it was just a coincidence. It wasn't, Sophia said, a sad smile curving her lips. Gabriel was very sick. He knew. One night before he passed, he asked Raven to guard the melody. He said that if anything happened, Raven should stay and ensure the melody of the promise was never forgotten, the promise that he would always be there somehow. A heavy pause hung in the air, filled only by the beeps of the monitors. Ilara brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes welling up. Gabriel gave this feather to Raven, Sophia continued, holding it up. As a symbol. He said, if one day you need to find me, or if someone needs hope, this feather will be your melody. It will sing our story. Sophia looked at the baby in the incubator, then at the feather in her hand. Raven. He never forgot. He stayed here for 7 years. 7 years, waiting for the melody to be played again, waiting for someone who needed it, for this baby. At that exact moment, one of the baby's monitors, which had previously displayed an erratic and worrying line, began to stabilize. A small improvement, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Dr. Almeida's eyes widened, and he quickly approached. The vital signs. They're stabilizing, he murmured, incredulous. It's a miracle. Outside, perched on the NICU window, Raven was watching. His dark eyes shone with profound understanding. He let out a soft caw, almost a murmur, unlike any sound he had ever made. It wasn't a lament, but a song, a melody of relief and a promise fulfilled. Sophia raised the feather, her eyes fixed on the raven. A wave of emotion swept through the room. Mendes felt tears stream freely down his face. The understanding of that 7-year mystery hitting him with overwhelming force. Ilara openly wept, her hand on Sophia's shoulder, offering and receiving comfort. Dr. Almeida, his voice choked, looked at the baby, then at Sophia, his faith in science shaken by the pure and undeniable strength of that love and loyalty. The tears became a collective cry, a sound of relief and profound emotion that united everyone in the room. It wasn't a cry of sadness, but of an understanding that transcended reason. Proof that love and loyalty can indeed break the barriers of species and time. Raven, having witnessed Gabriel's melody echo once more, gave a final, powerful thrust with his wings. He launched into the blue sky, a dark silhouette against the sun, flying eastward. His mission was complete. The promise had been kept. The melody finally had been played. The hospital, once a place of mystery and urgency, now breathed new hope. The tiny baby, stabilized, had a chance. Sofia Ribeiro, with Gabriel's feather in her hands, felt a decades-long burden lifted from her shoulders. Gabriel's story was no longer just a note in a file, but a hymn of loyalty and hope that would resonate forever through the corridors of that hospital, a reminder that some promises are eternal and that the melody of love never falls silent.